Welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. This is a podcast for male survivors of sexual abuse and assault, whether as a child or as an adult. Know that you are not alone and the abuse was not your fault. My name is Mike Chapman. I'm a certified recovery life coach and also a survivor. Let's find hope and healing together. And welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. I'm your host, Mike Chapman, and with me today is Sean Wheeler from Starfish Ministries. More about him in a moment. And if you would like to join us live on future podcast episodes, you can learn how to do so at polarlifeconsulting.com/live. And we do have a live audience here with us today. A reminder to audience members, we honor anonymity. We will only state your name if you manually type it in with your question and or comment in the chat section. And with that, let me introduce our guest. Sean Wheeler is a survivor of preteen sex trafficking for almost 5 years. And during that time, he was used in child sexual abuse material. While his family moved away from that area, other abusers would find him until age 19, when he determined to no longer to be used. In 2018, Sean founded Starfish Ministries in Colorado to provide a voice for boys in the public arena. He works directly with several other organizations and has been involved in lobbying Congress for pending legislation approval. He provides HT 101 and above trauma-informed training. I'll ask him about what all that means. And Sean is also ordained and works in prison ministry, even with convicted sex offenders. He has been interviewed on 100 Huntley Street in Toronto and the 700 Club. His story has been told in Psychology Today and other publications. Today, over 6 million people worldwide have heard his story. So, welcome, Sean Wheeler, and we will start like we do most of our podcasts with 4 questions. Now it's time for 4 questions, that part of the podcast when we get to know our guest a bit better by asking a few questions.
So, Sean, what is your favorite food memory?
Well, first, thank you for the kind welcome. And I love food of all kinds, and I don't know that I have a favorite memory. I've been all over the world, and so I've experienced amazing different foods. So yeah, I couldn't pick one.
So what places have you visited? Any particular dishes that stand out?
Well, when I was in Afghanistan with the military, we had some amazing food over there from our guy in our compound who could cook. He said like naan bread, for example, and other types of curries. And he always told me, yeah, the Indians claim they invented this, but it was really us. The Afghan naan bread is huge. It's like a good 1.5 feet, 2 feet wide.
Right.
And so I had wonderful food there. When I was visiting Egypt one time, just in the military when I was still young, active duty, our tour guide took us to his family restaurant. We had camel hump, which tasted like roast beef. And I remember my mom always saying, if someone's gracious enough to make something special for you, at least try it. So
Absolutely. That's great advice, by the way. Absolutely. Because people cook with love and you want to receive that love. And yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're visiting another country.
Yes, right. So a lot of food memories.
Wow. Yes. So how was the camel hump? Did they spice it? I mean, I'm imagining this big mound of flesh. I'm assuming they like slice it up and...
Yeah, I mean, honestly, as I recall, it looked and tasted like roast beef.
Huh.
So
Wow.
I felt bad that some camel had to give up, but the guide told us that, yeah, when they get past a certain age, they can't carry anything anymore, and it's humane to...
Right.
And we don't waste anything. So it tasted like roast beef.
Wow, wonderful. So what is your favorite Christmas or holiday memory?
Even from the time when I was a little kid, I will say Christmas was always one time a year that I was safe. And now I have particularly fond memories. My mom's mother, my maternal grandmother, knew how to wrap presents in such a way she didn't have to put names on them. You could figure out who they were by easily guessing. And I got a pair of skis one year when I was 9, I think so. But she had him wrapped up to look like a rattlesnake, and I just knew the rattlesnake is mine.
Wow. Wow. I can't imagine how you would get skis to look like a rattlesnake without breaking the skis. But I love the concept you said Christmas felt safe. And I think that relates to me that whatever happened, because I was expected to be at all these family events on both sides of the family, that none of the bad stuff happened.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, interesting, interesting. So, what is your favorite church or house of worship memory?
I think for me, that honestly is first time I walked into my current church. The pastor gave a message that evening titled "Forgiving Those That Hurt You," and I went up and talked to him after that. First, I asked him, "Do you really believe what you just preached?" And keep in mind, this man is from Louisiana, and so he tells the story better than I do. But he tells the congregation, I realized he wasn't arguing with me. He was searching for something. And he told me, I don't understand. Because I said, how can I forgive people when I don't know who they are? And then I told him about being trafficked as a little kid, and most were strangers. And I thought I had to have a name to associate with a face. I said, how do I forgive them if I don't know who they are? And his answer was, it's okay. God does. And I
Yeah,
realized I didn't need a name. All I had to do was want to, and that led to me ultimately being forgiving of them. I have. I think oftentimes abuse survivors struggle with forgiving themselves, and I've done that too.
right.
And as I was walking out that night, he called out to me. He said, I'll see you next week in church. And I realized these people just heard my story and they didn't care. And I get to come back, and I've been there ever since. And that was all the way back in 2012.
Right.
So, and I will tell you, I sometimes get emotional when I speak, but those are good emotions, and that's a good one for me because I found a home.
Right, absolutely. So, moving on, and you've touched on your story already. Would love to know more about your story, whatever abuse history and trafficking history you want to share. And then, like a lot of our stories, they can jump back and forth in the timeline. I know mine does. A lot of the stories on this podcast do that. So if you need to jump around the timeline, feel free. And then from there, I'd love to hear more about your healing journey, what things you have tried that have worked, and what things you have tried that did not work. Hearing more about that. And then I'd love to know more about Starfish Ministries and all that you're doing today to help others. So please proceed.
Yeah. So you want me to start with sort of initially what happened is the
Yeah,
question?
right,
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, and I've done this enough. I'm kind of familiar with the routine of what to say and all that. So,
right.
well, the grooming for me began around age 4. And it was at that time there was a lot of dysfunction going on in our home. My parents' marriage was falling apart, and so these network had older boys in the neighborhood, teenagers, start to connect with me, and basically they're the ones who did the grooming, and then somewhere between 5 and 6 I was eventually handed over to the adult ringleader who used me as well. And when I talk about being used or whatever, I talk about sexual molestation, but I don't get into details. I mean, people can pretty
Right.
much figure out what that means. And then they
So,
knew,
so were your parents involved, or how did you get brought? Who was grooming you at age 4, and how did your parents? How did you get into this ringleader?
well, my parents were not involved.
Okay.
The boys that knew me, this was a small town in the Midwest, like
Hmm.
5,200 people. And
Okay.
so they lived in the neighborhood where I lived. I would find out later that the ringleader was a business associate of my father, so he knew our family dynamic, and I'm pretty
Right.
sure that's how he picked me out.
Mm.
And eventually, when I was turned over to him, by the time I got there, the way they kept me silent was the older boys hit me a few times, and then adults did along the way too. And they tell me, no one's going to want you anymore, and we'll kill your dog. They threatened our dog, and well, that works on a 5-year-old. And
Right. Yeah.
so I was silent, and I became very good at hiding it because what would happen was I lived in a town and in an era when little kids would go out at 8 in the morning, come back at lunch,
Right.
and that included 4-year-olds. And
Hmm.
so there were time frames there of 4 hours that people could find you and take you off and do their thing and bring you back, and that's essentially what happened. So
Right.
I was never taken away per se. I was taken to a larger city near us where we lived at the time briefly and then brought back. And I found out later because we crossed state lines that was interstate trafficking and then it becomes an FBI issue. But that's today. That wasn't back then. And so people have
Right.
asked me, how is it that you could be let out on your own? It's just what people did in those days. I tell people to look at the old Andy Griffith show, and
Hmm.
Opie comes in and to see his dad at the sheriff's office at noon, and well, I haven't seen you since breakfast. What you been doing? Well, 8 to 12. That's or and then 12 to 5 or whenever the sun went down, because that was the
Right.
rule. When the sun goes down, the lights come on, you come inside.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And so during those periods, they knew where I lived, and the car would pull up once I was fully in the network, and they had their buzz terms. It's like you just knew their key thing for me was it's time to perform, and I knew what that meant. And
Yeah.
so now I will tell people often they think it's the creepy stranger in the park. I've seen those kinds of people. More later when I was a teenager, and it's like, I know what you want, and you're a creep, go away. But in that town, it was respectable people that you would have no clue, and they're all gone now, I'm sure.
Right.
And whether anyone was ever held accountable, I couldn't tell you because
Right.
I didn't speak for years. So that's how that all began. Now, during the period, we moved away from that town just before I turned age 10, and that's when we moved to Arizona. And but during that period from age 5 to age 10 were one of the times where I was used in child porn. And I just got into an argument the other day with somebody on LinkedIn about it's properly called CSAM. Saying it's porn is it's like, look, there's nothing good about that. It's not like one carries a good image and the other doesn't. But I ended up telling him, asking him, are you a survivor of it? Well, no. And I said, then don't ever presume to tell someone who is what I can call it. And yes, I get that CSAM is, they keep
Right.
coming up with new acronyms. And I
Right.
basically said, let's stop arguing semantics and deal with the issue.
Right. And I think the issue with it is the pornography assumes consent, that this 5-year-old or 8-year-old is consenting to these acts with permission, volunteering. It's yeah, like for the video, okay, I'm ready for my close up and they're smoking a cigarette. No,
Yeah.
they're children. And so to call it what it truly is, child sexual abuse materials generated from the act of child abuse, of sexual child abuse. So describing it, that's not just pornography, but you're performing sex acts on children who by definition cannot consent. Yeah, pornography, yeah, it's too much of a buzzy word that it yeah, I don't know. It seems to me it implies consent, whereas CSAM, it's like, no, you're taking pictures of this child's abuse.
Yeah, that's the argument I've heard, and
Right.
my
Yeah.
only my initial response is only an idiot would ever assume a child has ever consented, whether you call it pornography or whatever else. But the reality is, I've worked with enough people in law enforcement too who tell me that the vast majority of child porn, I still use that term because I'm used to it, but the vast majority of
Right.
that material produced in the United States involves, when it's preteens, white American born males more than any other subject.
Mm.
And so that's the other thing people get upset at me about. And that's because I'll say, look, the great argument is that it's this group or that group. And I wish groups would stop trying to segregate abuse victims into smaller and smaller subgroups because it really doesn't help. I think
Right.
every victim counts. But I respect the term CSAM. Now there's a new one coming out, CSIM, which is self-induced child sexual abuse material. And it's like, see, we're just going to keep coming up with another list of acronyms. And I'm tired of the acronyms. Let's acknowledge that boys are, in fact, more often used in child abuse material in the United States than girls. And the
Yeah.
largest group used are my group. Now, that doesn't mean other racial groups aren't used or that girls aren't used. And I don't minimize any of that. But when you have the majority of it being boys, we need to stop pretending that doesn't happen, that it only happens to girls. Because it happened to me at 7. And for the record, it was me, another boy, and a girl I knew from school, 2 men, and a woman who were
Mm.
involved. And that's the other thing. People say women are never involved in this. It's only men.
Right.
And it's like, what a load of crap.
Right. That's why I like that they're moving away from the terms pimps and johns that both imply males, that it's sellers and buyers,
Yeah.
and both can be males and females, just like victims as survivors can be both males and females.
Exactly. And I point out, yes, I agree that the majority are men, but I would say that probably somewhere around 35% of the people who bought me as a preteen were women. So now
Mm,
some of these large organizations that say maybe 1 or 2% are women, and the rest are men. And maybe 1 or 2% of the victims are boys. I think groups are finally getting away from that. So,
right.
but yeah, so I was in that during that time. I was used in the child abuse material. I was also subjected at one point to a certain form of satanic ritual abuse, affiliated with an organization. But I tell people by the time I was 9, I knew how to drink. I knew how to smoke. I knew all about pornography. I knew every position, every kind of thing. Well, there were ones I hadn't heard about until I grew up, but for the most part, your general sexual acts. And I thought, I guess, I just assumed that was normal because that was the only normal I knew by that point.
Right.
And then
Right.
I realized, just like the Predators told me, we'll show you what love is. Well, I assumed, okay, that's why you comply. That's what love is. Then as a teenager, I eventually figured out that it was fake love. And even then I thought, well, fake is better than nothing. And then as a young adult, I finally said, to heck with that. I'd rather have nothing than this.
Right.
So,
Right, absolutely. We do have a question from our audience from Steve. He asks, how difficult is it to work with offenders? You did mention working with offenders. And I don't know if we're jumping the gun, if you're going to get to that later on, because I know you do work with offenders. And how does that work?
well, we can jump around. That's fine. I think it's a valid question. I do it from a biblical perspective. I am an ordained pastor now. I've had, put it this way, I've had 5 different law enforcement organizations tell me now that when somebody like me comes around, offers forgiveness and hope instead of condemnation, they see the reoffending rate in those groups drop by 90%.
Mm-hmm.
So if I need a secular reason to do what I do, that's why I do it. But from a biblical Christian perspective, I forgive because God forgives me. And I tell people, look, forgiveness doesn't let people off the hook, it lets us off the hook. And in other words, God's judgment will be much more severe than anything I could think up. So let him deal with it. Why I carried a weight around for years that was just hate. I heard a good saying one time. Uh, Holding on to unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies.
Right,
And
exactly.
I think that's true. Now, when it comes to individuals, I will tell you that probably 97%, maybe even 99% of those I meet, I find out lived a past like mine.
Mm,
And I can't hate people who went through that. Now, they made some bad
right,
choices, but I would also say the vast majority honestly feel bad about that. There are some notorious ones that you hear about, like the priest that was sharing a cell with a double convicted murderer, and he ended up telling the guy, I'm worth more than 300 of them, referring to the boys he'd raped.
mm,
And the guy, the killer, was like, I've had enough of this. He got down off top bunk and he killed the guy. He
well,
said, I'm in for 2 life sentences, 3 ain't going to matter. And so there are people who are unrepentant. But my answer when people approach me that way is, well, I get to leave. You have to stay. I lived through the real event. You can try to press the replay button all you want by telling me what you would have done, but I don't have to stay and listen to it. I forgive you. I hope you discover something better, but I am done and I walk away. But that's only happened a couple of times where people were very so corrupt and so dark in their soul that
right.
they're I won't even give them the dignity of describing what they would say to me. But thing is, I'm on the other side of the cell. I get to walk.
Right. So, how receptive are those offenders when you come and share your story and share your healing journey with all of the exposure you've had? We haven't heard all the story yet, but I know a lot of your story. But does that reach them? Do they say "Wow" and then want to learn more from you? How are you received in those environments?
I'm received very well, and like I've said, I've had law enforcement people tell me they track that sort of thing, and they've been able to tie it down to having me and others speak and say,
Hmm.
I understand this is what happened to you. I understand these are mistakes, but there is a path that's better. And the reoffending rate honestly drops. Now, they are always, I'd say, for the vast majority, are very receptive. One time I shared a group with 25, and I said, look, I'll hang around talking to each and every one of you. And they all waited politely, and I did. And I cried a lot with people when they cried with me. And the last man I probably remember the most um, came up to me and he said, look, I just got out of prison because I had a CSAM collection and I deserved it because it was wrong. But he said, how can a man like you forgive a man like me? And I said, because God forgives me.
Yeah.
And so I looked at him and with that I said, look, as the person who was on the other side of that camera, I release you from that. Now you take it to the cross, you get God's forgiveness, and you move on with your life and know that it's not going to be perfect, but you'll have an eternity with someone who is. And he was able to get through the system. He was able to reestablish. He was able to reconnect with his family. And I could see this weight fall off him because no one ever told him he was forgivable.
Right.
And the Bible says there's only one unforgivable sin. And the other thing I tell people, I spoke for a friend. She's a female survivor, ran a faith-based ministry as well. And I had a guy come up after me afterwards and said, well, I heard you talk about this prison stuff, but do you think they're worth it? And I looked at him and I said, what does your Bible say? And he, what don't you mean, young man? And I said, the Bible says God's heart is that none should perish.
Yeah.
Don't you dare stand in judgment of them, or me either for that matter, trying to help people understand a different path. And I said,
Right.
ultimately, you have to remember you never looked into the eyes of anyone that Jesus doesn't love, but they have to make the choice to receive
Right.
it. And
Right.
so, yes, I find them very receptive, and I don't know actual names or numbers. I just have what the law enforcement people tell me is that group. The last one I worked with was probably about 30, and they had one guy reoffend after I was there. And so I pray for those people
Right.
because that's what we do.
Right. Now, going back to your story, you left off around age 8,
Yeah.
involved with the CSAM child porn industry, and then continue from there.
Well, after that event happened, eventually my parents got divorced. My mom had taught in a Catholic school, and when my parents did get divorced, she ended up getting fired because they said we can't have a divorcee teaching. And so she ended up
Wow.
getting another job in another state in Arizona, and so we moved from the Midwest to Arizona just before I turned age 10. Now, I was excited about that. But up until that point in time, I mean, it wasn't for me a weekly or daily thing. Sometimes there would be like a month or 2 months or whatever between events, as I call them.
Right.
Although I tell people it's not a competition. I've had friends who've had a lot worse than me, and I've had people tell me they only got abused once and it stuck with them. And so it's like,
Right.
don't put it down to I had it worse than you because that's just wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's not a contest. It's all bad and it's all damaging. And one little event can cause irreparable damage to
Right.
someone, especially who doesn't have the resources to deal with it at the time.
Because, when I speak now, I say, look, it's a rare day when I don't relive those events in my head. But now I know how to put them in context, see them for what they were. And truthfully, if I ever forgot what had happened, then I might forget how I got sort of rescued from all of that. And so we moved away from the Midwest, but my counselor that I first got told me, but by that time you were programmed to assume that's just what people got to do to you.
Right.
And so other predators would find me. I would get hit on in public bathrooms
Yeah.
or wherever. And I just assumed I had to go with them. And honestly, the last time well, before that, I was on my own at 16 just before I entered my senior year in high school or
Hmm.
junior year in high school. And I ended up living with my sister for a while and then moving into an apartment with my brother for my last 2 years of high school.
So why were you alone at 16? You left home or they kicked you
Well,
out or what happened?
no, not really. My parents were divorced. My mom was getting remarried, moving to Dallas. And honestly, at 16, I didn't want to leave Arizona and go to
Right.
and become stuck in some big city school. The
Right.
idea just totally freaked me out. It's like, I like my little high school just the way it is. And so she actually gave me the choice, but for all intents and purposes, I was an emancipated minor.
Hmm.
And so the recruiter came along when I was in my senior year, and just after I turned 18, I did a delayed enlistment for when I graduated high school because I
Hmm.
thought I don't want to go to college. I'm not really interested yet. I thought I would be. And I thought the Navy won me over because I always loved reading stories about boats and sailing and faraway places and all that. And I will say I got all of that from the Navy. And I was able to stay in the Navy 20 years, 21 actually. But the last time I was gang assaulted was at my very first duty station after boot camp and training school.
Hmm.
And the guy that I worked for orchestrated that with several, I think, civilian contractors on the island where I was stationed. They ended up getting me drunk. I passed out. I woke up and they had me in a private room with no
Hmm.
clothes on and yeah, essentially bent over a pool table.
Right.
And then I passed out again. Well, that's why at that point in time, why I say I finally drew a line in the sand and I said, no more people going to be using me because see way back when I was a little kid, somebody told me by the time you turn 18, 19 or 20, you should just die because you won't be worth anything.
Wow.
And I turned 19 up there and that put me into a panic mode. It's like, if is somebody going to kill me before I turn 20? Um, and that's when all that happened. And once I made it past 20, that's when I decided, okay, no more. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean I didn't go on to make stupid choices on my own.
Right. Right.
The sad thing is, a lot of sexual abuse survivors are very promiscuous. But I figured at least it's my own choice now.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
that's sort of my first 20 years in a nutshell.
Yeah, I know military sexual assault like that is actually very common. It goes very unreported, and then when it is reported, yeah, it's swept under the rug, oftentimes ignored. It's hard to find any justice in the military when those sexual assaults happen, especially from service person to service person,
I will
and
tell
even
you,
more especially male on male. So, yeah,
yeah, and back in the day, I will tell you that I did file a disability claim with the VA through the VA for military sexual assault disability. I got talked into it and I thought, well, I really don't need it, although I could use the money. But so I went through their process and even their own application says you do not have to have reported at the time in order to be considered a valid claim. So I
right,
went through that process. I interviewed with the shrink. He's like, I looked you up online. I know what you do for a living. I know about your past. You want to talk about that? And I said, well, here's the deal. I joined the Navy in part because I didn't want to be living on the streets. That's why I decided I didn't want to go to high or college, and I didn't know where else I was going to go. So I did join the Navy. And so I was happy as a clam for my first 13 months because I I found stability and structure. And then this happens. And so I said that regardless of what happened to me in my past, it should have never happened to me in that situation. And I got a determination last year, and then I finally got the final report from the VA just a couple of weeks ago. I got the psychologist notes, and he did exactly what I thought he was going to do. He was going to say, yes, he has PTS, but he was traumatized long before he came in the military, and there's nothing in his record that supports the claims that he makes. And it's like, well, of course there wouldn't be, except for medical records that were done after they did that to me on my command. They sent me to an Air Force Base hospital to get a psych eval to try and get me out of the military, I think, and it didn't work. And so the VA turned me down for the
hmm,
disability claim because they said I didn't support it. So I have options, but I will say I do use the VA now, and I get really great service from the VA here in northern Colorado. And yeah, I love them all. They're very good to me.
Right.
So, but yeah, this is the national thing. So, but yeah, they turned me down because they said, well, he was already screwed up when he came in, so it's not our fault. That's not the question. I just want to call the psychologist and say, look, you pinhead, I proved to you how it had a negative impact on my life because after that point, I could never trust employers again. And
Right.
you want to say it didn't do anything to me?
Right. Yeah, I know it's hard when they realize, yeah, you already had abuse, though so often abuse survivors are reoffended against. I know when I went up against a Methodist church back in 2019 about the sexual assault I experienced by one of their head ministers, they used the fact that I had been abused to minimize the damage they would have to pay for. Well, it was like damaged goods. It's like, well, you already had this stuff when our guy abused you, so therefore we should be less responsible for your overall
Yeah.
therapy needs. It's like, okay, so justify and minimize, and so I'm damaged goods. So most of your perpetrators are going to find those people who are victims and most likely had already been victimized previously. So it's like, hey, that lessens my responsibility to, it's a slippery slope and it's not logical, but lawyers will use that for sure.
It is, and I have options. I may, pursue that, but that's exactly what they did. And for the record, as somebody who is a ordained Christian pastor, pastors who misuse, because, there are going to be fakes in the church, wolves in sheep's clothing, so to speak,
Right.
who misuse that position, I happen to think are held to a higher level of punishment or will be by the Creator than just your average person
Absolutely.
because they misuse God's grace to as an excuse to offend.
Right. It's spiritual abuse on top of the physical and sexual abuse. It's spiritual abuse and abuse of power.
Yeah, I've had people say, well, the church is really heavily involved in it. Yes, there certainly is that aspect of it, as we know from recent times. But
Yeah,
let me
but
be
often
clear.
not in a good way.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. There are offenders in churches, but I say, look, as a little kid, I was never once touched inappropriately at church or at school. And so you can argue all you want that somehow they ought to be held to a higher standard, but let's don't put me on. That's not the only place it happens to boys or girls. So,
Right.
but yeah, the fact that this guy would come back and do that, I almost thought when I went into the interview I shouldn't tell him anything about that. But then he's going to go and say he wouldn't talk about it, but here's his presence online, and so he would get me one way or the other. But I
Right.
have recourse, and so yeah. But like I said, once I left that duty station, I found good people that I worked with. I had good COs. My first CO was somebody who encouraged me to get off active duty, go to college. At that point, I did. I stayed in touch for years with him. He helped me to get a commission. I joined the Navy as a seaman recruit, and I left as a lieutenant.
Hmm.
And after 21 years. And so I'm very happy with my career. And I did see a lot of the world, and I have a lot of good memories.
Right.
So it's
You got
joined
the
the
good and the bad, yeah. So now let's move on to your healing journey. What kind of things did you do? I mean, you mentioned some of the things that you sought out help with the military and so forth. What things have you tried that have worked, and what things just haven't worked in your healing journey?
Well, I think probably a good way to start is to plug my own book.
Absolutely.
The best work I have done has been with individual counselors. And the first one I ran into, I connected with her through the church I used to go to, and I started working with her. And at first she said, "Can you talk a lot?" And I said, "Not without blubbering and falling apart." And she said, "Can you write?" Writing I can do. I have a degree in journalism, so I would write. And then I'd come in and I'd look down and not even look up from the page and read every word as I'd written it. And she'd sit there and do her needlepoint while she's listening to me. And a few weeks later, she said, "I think you're going to write a book and share your testimony." It's like, nah, no
Hmm.
way. No, not going to. Never. Not going to do it. So,
Yeah.
um,
Never say never.
yes. And so, sure enough, we got through that, and I ended up taking my written notes and our process that I went through in my counseling. First, I talk about the difficulties in finding help as a male survivor. I've had
Right.
organizations hang up the phone on me here in Colorado. There's one that's supposed to serve sexual assault victims, and I called them and said, "Do you have any resources for males?" And they were like, "No." And I was in the process of saying, "Can you tell me anyone who does?" And they hung up the phone on me. And I'll
Wow.
never forget that. That's the kind of indicative of the hostility found. Well, then I finally ran into this counselor. So I talk about the challenges of male survivors finding help. And then I talk about the process that we went to dealing with shame, guilt, fear, hate, anger, unforgiveness, and spiritual warfare. I will tell
Right.
you, I come from a charismatic background now. I do believe in gifts of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
I also will tell you that I've always believed in angels. And I talk about this in my book. When I was a little kid, there was a kid that showed up in my neighborhood who was dressed funny, but I didn't care. We became really good friends. And they lived in a big house up on the hill, and we'd go over to his house and play. And then that seemed to fall off. He either our time, he went back or moved away or something. But a few years later, my elementary school was touring in that house. It was a museum by then,
Hmm.
and it was built in the early 1880s. And they got us into the kitchen of the house, and the tour guide said, "I bet you can't find the hidden panel in this kitchen." I walked right over. It was hidden in the wainscot around the kitchen sink wall and countertops. I pressed it, and it popped right up. And she said, "How did that was there?" I said, "Well, I used to play with the little boy who used to live here, and he showed me where it was." And she said, "Sweetheart, no one's lived in this house for 85 years.
Wow.
He had to have been an angel."
Yeah.
And then I would encounter him later in my counseling process while I was dealing with the demonic oppression, because that's another thing I outline in the book. I was
Right.
oppressed by actually 12 demons.
Hmm.
I was never possessed by them
Right.
for whatever reason, but we had to go through the process to get them pulled off, and he was there again to help me. And at that point, I knew he was an angel. And he's still a guardian angel assigned to me today. I have another one whose name, interestingly, is Michael. And the little one is named Nathan. And so I talk about that whole spiritual warfare process. Now, some people think they can read it and think you're making all that up or you were on drugs or whatever. I don't really care. I know what I know. I know what I saw and what I experienced. And that's about the best I can tell you. So that process, she led me, handed me over to another counselor, a male, so I learned trust of males. And then I had a few years off. Then I went back and worked with another one because the first one had moved away and did some amazing work there. And so I go back periodically and get what I call a tune up. But
Right.
so for me, the individual counseling thing works. I think for others, the group counseling stuff works. It just depends on the group.
Right. So, what have you tried that didn't work? Anything in your healing journey that just failed miserably, or yeah, you got nothing out of it and you moved on?
Yeah, for example, the VA did a thing up in Estes Park, which I was invited to for military sexual assault survivors, and it
Hmm.
was run by the chaplain. But as you know, the military chaplains are all faiths, and so and they were strictly prohibited from talking about certain aspects of Christian teaching, and which is like, okay, either you're a chaplain or you're not. And by the way, we're
Right.
the biggest faith in this country, but it just didn't work out well. One of the things they rare bits of advice was, and this might work for other people, but she said to all of us in the room, if you need to, remember and focus on a time when you were still innocent before it happened. And the reality is, I don't remember a time like that.
Yep. Me too. Yep.
So that didn't work. And then asking me what worked for me. And I said, well, I go through this process through my church. Well, we can't really go there. It's like, then why the hell did you ask? And I'm not saying anyone has to apply it. I'm just telling you what happened to me.
Right.
But if I didn't find that helpful, another one I didn't find helpful, honestly, are groups that want to mix it up. Like I'm okay with male and female survivors working together, but I have a real big annoyance with the whole trans community. And I've had people telling me, well, trans males experienced what happened to you. And it's like, we love on people and we don't deny their humanity, but don't ever tell me that when you're a biological girl or a woman, what happened to me happened to you, because it's a
Right.
physical impossibility, just like the reverse is true. And I've had more than one psychologist say that we know the traumatic impacts differ based on biology. But right now, I had one group call me, a national group. They wanted me to speak last October, and I told them politely no, um, because they wanted to mix it all up. And it's like, no, I'm sorry, you can't just pretend to be something you're not. And so, yes, I believe we love on people, but I think we need to recognize it as gender dysphoria. 0.01% of the population actually deals with it. That's the other thing I won't do is when people ask me, what pronouns do you want us to use? My answer is take a wild guess, because if someone can look at me and not tell that I'm a male, they're an idiot, and I'm not going to waste my time.
Now, you mentioned in your intro you're actively lobbying Congress for pending legislation.
Yes.
And what exactly was the legislation you were proposing?
There's 5 bills that we're through PACT, and this is Protect All Children Against Trafficking out of New York City. I'm trying to remember the specific names of the bill. One of them involves providing survivors with access to monies that have been gotten from predators through convictions and things, and they want those provided to the survivors. Others involved, if somebody's below the age of 18, the rules should be different. And so there was one act that actually passed. A girl at 16 killed the guy who trafficked her for 7, 8 years, and at 16, reminder, and she ended up being sentenced, convicted of murder, and going to prison.
Right.
Well,
Probably
she
tried as
got
an adult. Yeah.
Yep, and she was released and pardoned under Trump, I think, the first Trump.
Hmm.
It could have been under Obama. I don't remember. It certainly wasn't under Biden. And so that's called Sarah's Act. The two that I basically focus on because of my experience, we're going through pushing the social media companies to be more accountable for what's on their platforms.
Right.
Now, section, I think it's 990 of or something of the Communications Act of 1986 says that people are not held responsible for the information that come out on their airwaves or on their social platforms. Well, that's an outdated rule. I understand why it was in place. It allows for freedom of speech and all that, but now it's come up, for example, this was last May, almost a year ago, when I was in DC working with Senator Durbin and Senator Graham on this and their staff, and they were supporting a bill that got approved in the Senate, and then it's on to the House, and I think it's looking to get approved there, that would hold social media companies accountable who spot it and don't report it and don't take it down.
Right.
Senator Graham got up and spoke. He said earlier in November of last year, so this would have been 2 years ago, we had Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook sitting in our congressional hearing room, and he said, we could do more about this material, but we choose not to. And Senator Durbin said, that made me so damn mad. I looked at him and I said, you may choose not to, but we're going to choose for you. And if you don't start dealing with it, reporting it, and taking it down, you're going to be going to prison, Mr. Zuckerberg, and we will hold you accountable. And sure enough, I think the bill is going to get passed this spring, and to hold Facebook, because they have pages on Facebook that are promote that and promote links to, bad places. And well, we can't do anything about it. Now that includes Instagram, and every other platform out there. And so that's kind of what I focus on, because what they want to hear in Congress from me is, how did that impact you? And I can get back with them and say, look, I am 64 years old. I was used in CSAM at 7, and I still remember it, and it still bothers me to this day. And you really shouldn't. You should just be able to grow up as a child free from that and free from those memories. So prevent more like me being created, and shut this stuff down and hold these people accountable, because globally, child prostitution and child sexual abuse material are $150 billion a year business. We got to fight it.
Right, absolutely. You also mentioned in your intro that you provide HT 101 and above trauma-informed training. What is HT 101?
Sort of an industry, if you want to call it. It stands for human trafficking.
Oh, okay.
So I provide basics. I tell, look, this is how it happened. This is where it was. Sort of similar to my intro. I talk about the impacts on boys, how they're different than girls. I talk about there's a lack of service. So when I talk about trauma informed, that's what I was doing when you saw me in Salt Lake City, was
Right.
speaking to a group of medical professionals saying, I'm getting really kind of sick and tired of being told, well, we don't know how to help boys when they come in, so we only set up for girls. It's like, guess what? 95% of what they need is the same thing you give to the girls. The only thing that's going to be different is counseling. And make sure you put a boy with a psychologist who understands how to work with males. That's the only thing they need different. And a lot
Right.
of these people were like, wow, we didn't realize it was that simple. Well, what are you thinking? A child comes
Right.
in, and that's the other problem I pointed out because we had law enforcement there. I said, and as for you guys, you get a boy on the street who's maybe 10, maybe 16, and you assume he's a predator and up to no good, and you throw him into the doggone juvenile justice system. Did it ever occur to you that he's under 18 and he's not a predator, he's a victim or a runaway or something?
Right.
Far too often, boys are thrown into the juvenile justice system and treated like criminals, while girls are assumed to be, oh, just not. And some are. But
Right.
let me be clear. I ran into, as a preteen, some very predatory teenage girls who were very capable of evil.
Right.
And they don't get off the hook just because they're, the old sugar and spice and everything nice. It's like, no, girls can be just as rotten as boys and just as
Right.
good. And so, but that was my whole push with trauma informed, is saying boys need this, but they also need just basic food, a medical checkup, a place to sleep, a place to be safe and off the streets. So that's trauma informed therapy. And different people have different approaches, but that's what I did.
Absolutely. So tell me more about Starfish Ministries. What exactly do you do? I know you have working with the horse farm, and you have equine therapy, and you do a whole bunch of other stuff. So what do you do with Starfish Ministries?
Well, essentially, we talked about the human trafficking training. I do that. I also do the congressional lobbying. That's part of it.
Hmm.
I do support the equine therapy ranch here in Colorado called Lorraine Ranch. Actually, you can find their support work for boys on what's called the Restoring Joseph Project. And I actually work with them. Through them, we're doing another project called the Daniel Academy. And the Daniel Academy will be the first of its kind safe home for boys 12 to 18 in the entire country. If you can believe it, every state has at least two homes for girls. There may be one other home for boys in the country, and the one I'm aware of is really not just for boys. This will be the only boys only home in the country, and it's in a secure location here in Colorado. It's called the Daniel Academy.
Hmm.
And it's through Sarah's home in Colorado Springs. Well, they're about to open up. And so for one example, one year was given a donation of a high-end video production, which I didn't really need. So I re-gifted it to Sarah's home for the Daniel Academy, and they put it to good use. They raised the several $1 million they needed to raise. They got approved by the state. The roads and things that are needed are under construction. There's going to be two homes actually to start in this location for boys. They'll be safe out there. And so that's another project that I work on. Most recently, related to my prison ministry work, I've connected with a group called Justice Defenders out of the UK.
Hmm.
They have asked me to come to Africa with them into three countries, Kenya, Gambia, and Uganda.
Hmm.
I am scheduled to go to Kenya in May.
Right.
And they work in the Kenyan prison system. They go in and help people who are falsely incarcerated get out. They will take some and train them up as attorneys, and they go back. And to date, Justice Defenders, I think, has helped get over 400 people free since 2002
Well,
from prisons in Kenya, Uganda, and Gambia. Now, the reason they're interested in me is because they heard through a friend of mine who is also falsely incarcerated but got out about me, and they called me and they said, want you to talk to our team, because it turns out, they said, we deal with a lot of people in prison who share your past, and we also deal with people in prison who were convicted of being sex offenders, and we've never heard of anybody in all our travels in the world like you who actually goes to prison, and we'll talk to convicted sex offenders. But they said, ultimately, we don't have a good approach with these people. We don't know how to talk to them. Will you come and be our voice? And I
what
said,
an honor.
yes.
Yes.
So I've got to raise the money. I think it's going to come through. But it's like, yeah, that's my purpose. And It brings me to tears because the first meeting I had with them, they had a group of ladies that worked in a prison in Uganda, and they said, "Well, we have a surprise for you." The ladies put together a song, and I sang this beautiful song in Ugandan, which I have no idea what it means. But I said, you brought me to tears, and I said, okay. And
Right.
so I'm really excited about working with these people. I will figure it out one way or another, and it may mean I have one benefactor. In all honesty, I don't have a lot of regular supporters for my nonprofit, and this year they gave me $3,000, and I think up next year I'll have to ask for more, but I think they're fine with it. They support a number of groups to the tune of 25,000, and so I don't ask for a ton because I didn't need it. Well, now I need more. So,
Right. Right.
but that's okay. It'll work out. So yeah, that'll be the work with the prison ministry long term. For Starfish, I want to buy 40 acres in Colorado. I want to build a home for people coming out of prison. I want to build them their own church. I want to provide them with job training based on the Dream Center model in LA. And if people can look them up, the Dream Center in LA,
Right.
I'm part of their prison ministry team. They take people off the street, and they have a 12 to 24 month program to get them on their feet, and they have like a 98% success rate.
Hmm.
And so that's what we want to do in Colorado. Now that I'm told is about a $10 million project. So in order to get there, some other things will have to fall into place, and they might be because something I don't know that I told you or not. My book is in the process of being used as the basis for a feature film,
Wow.
and it's still in the early production stages. And we have a working title. I'm happy sharing that. It's not anywhere you'll find out anywhere, but it's our working title is called Shadows in the Dark.
Hmm.
And it's based on the title of my book. By the way, I don't think I mentioned that. The title of my book is Wretch from the song Amazing Grace Saved a Wretch Like Me.
Hmm.
And the subtitle is Haunted by Shadows, Rescued by Jesus.
Hmm.
So that's in the process of being. We were going to title the movie Haunted by Shadows, but my producer keeps coming up with better, different ideas. And he said, get used to it because that's how it works out here
Yep.
in the
That's
film
right.
industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It'll change it several times.
I did, in order to get a writer through the Writers Guild of America, which does 99% of the screenplays for any movies that are made, I had to have what's called an agent of record. And so
Hmm.
that's a friend of mine who's an actual producer. He said, normally I charge for this, but I'm giving it to you for free
Wow.
because um, of what you do. And the fact is, people are going to, in Hollywood, are going to try and screw you out of your story.
Right.
And he said, so if you ever get a call from anyone, you get their number and you pass it on to me and I will follow up. And sure
Right.
enough, I've had people claim to work for Apple Studios and MGM, and my producer friend knows people at all of the studios. And you say, yeah, I called my friends. They never heard of this guy and I knew it was a fake. So
Right.
I have people in my corner. But yeah, he cracks me up.
Excellent.
He's like, yeah, we're up to a $25-30 million film right now, so it's pretty cheap. It's like, who the heck has that? Well, the studios do. So that's something on the horizon. I figure once that film comes out that I can put a plug in to get money to raise to build the church and the living accommodations for people coming out of jail in Colorado.
Right.
That's my
Excellent.
goal. So those are the things we work on: the prison ministry, the long-term thing, training, legislating, and then things like this.
Well, wonderful. You're doing so much. In closing, do you have any final words or thoughts for that survivor out there who's listening?
Yes, I do. First of all, the biggest thing to remember, one of the things I had to learn early on was it's not your fault.
Right.
It was never your fault. And when you start finding that, you realize that um, there's a huge difference between shame and guilt. And guilt is I did something. Shame says I am something. And you were never defined by that. And so
Right.
I tell people as long as there's breath in your lungs, there's hope in your life. God gave me a mission and a purpose. I didn't plan to spend my last years teaching people about a horrific past. People laugh. They say, "You found your purpose." And I said, "Yes, I have, but I wouldn't change it for the world now because I get to do good." But I
Right.
didn't get here instantly. It took time, and it took finding a connection and knowing there are going to be people who deny you, but there are going to be more people who believe you.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And great way to close. And with that, we'll see you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast.
If you would like to learn more about my coaching with Polar Live Consulting, where I provide one-on-one coaching and group coaching, both with a focus on healing for male survivors, reach out to me at polarliveconsulting.com. That is Polar spelled Polar. I would love to hear from you. I want to hear your story. If you would like your story featured on this podcast, contact me via my website. If you like this podcast, please rate and review because that's how other people can find me, and I really want to spread this message of healing and hope to others. And remember, you are not alone. Healing is possible, and the abuse was not your fault. Let me repeat that. The abuse was not your fault. See you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast.